what were you feeling when you first heard the news that 4 of your colleagues were arrested on alleged bribery and extortion charges?
Yeah, it was quite a morning, of course. I found out first from a text that I had received because nobody knew who the three, I think at the time, was the original number, but it became four, but nobody knew who they were. So I think people were like, oh, like checking in on me to see. And then I quickly, obviously went on online and saw that there were FBI agents at several of my colleagues' homes, and it's been a really long week and about a half at this point, that has been really fraught with emotion, because the reality is that these folks are human beings, and they're people that I've had to work with now for some time. So there's that element of it, but also just the sort of coming to that I have, that we're all going to be sort of looked upon because of the actions of people that are also on council. And so people had things to say about those other members, myself included, who weren't being indicted at the time, right? So there was that element, but also just the pressure and sort of thinking about, what does this look like outside of Toledo? What does this mean for Toledoans? The collective feelings that we're all having, I think we're all experiencing together. This is a moment that really sort of hits at the heart of what government is, that, we need to be trusted and transparent. And so we're all going to have to repair this hurt that we're all feeling at the same time together. And it's going to be quite a process.
You would like them to step down. They are still going through the legal process right now, but why should they in the meantime?
This is a really tough moment, because I think very strongly that people are innocent until proven guilty. And I believe that all of us deserve that right, because many of them, what I've read through media, they didn't know this was coming, and they want their opportunity to tell their story. And frankly, we haven't really heard their story. I'm a little bit surprised that none of them have released any type of statement at this point to say one thing or another. But ultimately they have that right. But I think, it's not like you're just a private citizen. When you're elected, there's certain expectations that we have. And I think too, given the sort of dynamics of everything that's happening right now, there's a global pandemic that is extremely serious. It means that, the rental assistance program that I helped roll out, we had more people apply for that program well before the deadline came than we can possibly even serve, right? So we understand that our need to serve Toledoans is great. There is civil unrest that is happening right now, sharing their stories and talking about their experiences and interactions with the Toledo Police Department. What I'm getting at is we have really huge issues that need to be addressed and need to be taken quite seriously. And in my opinion, we got to see what happens now that they're staying on. That Council President Cherry abruptly adjourned the meeting on Tuesday because the three members that are under investigation wouldn't leave the meeting. And so it meant that we can't conduct business during a time when we need to be focused on the needs of Toledoans. And so to me, it just is a distraction. I think it is probably better personally for them to be able to navigate through this without sort of the pressure that comes from the public, from the government to step down. But more importantly than anything, it's just that we have a lot of important things that need to be done, and they serve at this point as a distraction to those needs. And I think it's really hurting the city as a whole. And I feel for them, and I feel that they should fight for their innocence if they believe that they're innocent. But there comes a time when you're a leader that you have to recognize what the larger picture is, and I think this is one of those moments.
In all honesty, do you believe the charges against Yvonne Harper, Larry Sykes, Gary Johnson, and Tyrone Riley?
So, I've only read the complaint that everybody else has read, and it's lengthy. It seems quite, there are direct quotes. There are things, I read the whole thing. I've listened to stories. I've talked to to other folks, the reality is I certainly don't know all of the elements that are here. As the trials come forward, there will be more information likely that comes out. I'm sure that all of the investigation hasn't been released. And certainly their side hasn't come out yet either. So it's hard to say. And again, I stand by their ability to prove their innocence until proven guilty. And, I certainly hope that none of that happened. And I think it's a really terrible thing to have done if they did, because again, it erodes the trust that we need in order to operate efficiently. And so, I certainly, I'm not the jury, I'm not a judge, so I can't say whether or not they did, but, it is quite egregious if that's the case.
Because 3 of your federally charged colleagues refused to leave Tuesday's meeting, a vote on the mask mandate didn't take place. Today, Mayor Wade Kapsakavage mandated masks. So what is the benefit of having a mask mandate in place for the city of Toledo?
Yeah, I think, look, we can see what's happening around the world, right? There are countries that have very, very low numbers. They were able to control the spread of COVID-19 in a much better way than the US has. We have extremely poor leadership at the top. I mean, I don't think that there can be a question about that. The fact that in the first 99 days since the first case of COVID-19 in the US, there were over 1 million people infected. And then only 43 days later than that, we reached over 2 million. When other countries, other places around the world were scaling back their cases. They were really doing a good job. And the way that they did that was through proper social distancing, through strong stay-at-home orders, and orders to wear masks while in public. And the reality is that there are a lot of people that call into question whether or not the masks are effective or not. And the reality is you can wear a seatbelt and get in a car crash and you can still be killed in that car crash. However, since the implementation of seatbelts, far more lives have been saved as a result. Masks, to me, are no different. This is not a matter of freedom. This is not a matter, right? I mean, you still have that freedom. You cannot wear a mask if you want to. You just can't do it in public. And so, when we're talking about the spread of this, people might not understand the gravity of what's happening because we're not in New York City, right? We haven't seen in Toledo what it feels like because we've done a really good job in the beginning of controlling this. And in a way, it almost shoots us in the foot, right? The fact that we had a governor who came out very strong on this issue, who implemented a lot of strong measures right from the get-go, he showed us that we can control it, except now that we haven't seen it and the levels, right? We haven't become Italy or these other hotbeds, if you will. And so I think people just have this perception that it's not as bad as it is, but it's only because we haven't allowed it to be as bad as it can be here in Toledo. And I think very strongly that all of us have a shared duty to protect one another in every way that we possibly can. And a part of that is by wearing masks. When I walk through Kroger, I see so many people without masks and they're with their families and they have their children and they're likely going to go visit other family members, maybe a grandma or a grandpa, and that's who's really at risk, and by wearing a mask, you could potentially save your grandparents' lives. And I just, look, I have a beard and it's oppressive enough in the summer to have a beard, I'm sweating under this thing when I'm outside, it is what it is, but it's a part of my identity and I want it. But, I have a choice. In the summer, I can shave it off so I can be more comfortable, just like wearing a mask right now feels uncomfortable because I'm already sweaty from a beard, but I also I couldn't possibly live with myself if I wasn't doing all that I can to protect people who I love, who I admire, who I trust, and just even, maybe you didn't rise to this level, Jaden, and you and I just interacted in Kroger, but the fact that we were both wearing masks means that we would both be safe, So, I mean, it's just important to me that we do what we can to protect one another.
If there were to be another spike in COVID-19 cases, which we hope not, what should residents do to protect themselves and others?
Look, I think, we've seen the images coming out of Put-in-Bay, for instance. And I am friends with people or follow people on Instagram or Facebook who I've seen at Put-in-Bay. But even right here in Toledo, I've seen pictures of people inside bars, 11 o'clock on a Friday night. No one's wearing masks. Everyone's breathing. Think about when you are out and it's cold and you can see your breath, right? You only can see your breath because it's cold. But the reality is, even right now in the heat of summer, every time I speak, I am putting out that same level of breath, right? The same spread. So when you're in a bar, when you're in a public place, your risk is quite great, especially when you're inside and you're not wearing a mask. I think that even in light of the fact that we might not see the increased numbers that the other parts of our state, other parts of our country are seeing, it means that that's a good thing and that we should continue to do what we can to keep those numbers down. And the way that we do that is by being responsible. Don't hang out in large groups. Don't go to bars in the evening without a mask on. Don't even go in the grocery store without a mask. Try not to touch things that you don't need or that you have no interest in, right? Stay at home as much as possible. If you feel sick at all, tell your employer, I don't feel well, and stay home. I mean, we all should be doing everything we can, again, to protect one another.
Switching gears to police reform legislation, a vote on that was put on hold also due to the meeting being adjourned because a few of your colleagues refused to leave the meeting. How will council business be handled moving forward? If this were to happen again, how will things be voted on?
Yeah, I mean, the great unknown right now is whether or not folks are going to resign. If there's there are several other options that exist as well. I mean, can Section 35 of the Toledo Charter be invoked here, and can council remove other members of council? Our legal department is looking into that. ORC 3.16 has been asked to be looked at, and our legal department is looking at that. Can the county prosecutor, can the state attorney general remove these folks from council during this time, or suspend their time on councils, right? So there's a lot of unknowns as to how we will conduct business moving forward. I think it's certainly it's not sustainable in any manner for us to just be adjourning meetings and to not be conducting business, because like I've already pointed out in this interview, there are a number of really important issues that have huge magnitude that we must do. We have to continue to operate our city. So it's not sustainable for us to just not be holding meetings. However, my hope is that, once we figure out what our path forward is, that we continue to listen to the community, that we continue to hear from folks who are sharing their stories and their experiences of their interactions with police, good or bad, right? I'm hearing from people on all sides. And I think what people are starting to recognize is that not everybody's experience is always the same. Right? I mean, my experience is different from other folks because of my sexuality. Folks who have different skin colors than me, their experience is different because of that. And these things, we shouldn't have different experiences. I think that's the thing that we're all trying to say. But the reality is that because of these characteristics, because of these identities, we do have different experiences. And I think it leads to good discussion. We're all feeling a little uncomfortable right now. We're all feeling a little raw because a lot of these things aren't talked about, right? Like when I grew up, I was told, don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion, right? And I think that is a disservice because I didn't really engage as a younger person in conversations because I grew up in a small village outside of Toledo where most people looked like me, and until I recognized that my sexuality was different, I was pretty homogenous. I felt the same way as everybody else around me. It wasn't until I really got to know and started engaging in conversations with diverse people that I understood the differences that occur. And I think that all of us need to recognize that level of difference and I'm really talking about privilege here, right? And what it means and sort of the unconscious bias that we all represent, every single one of us, and what it means. And I hope that these conversations can continue because this isn't about, you are either on the side of the police or you're against them, right? I don't want to dilute a conversation into us versus them. It's not one of those moments. It's really just taking a look at something and saying, what can we do to make this better? What can we do to ensure that people of color that live in our city don't feel like they're constantly being harassed? Because that's what I hear the majority of people of color in Toledo tell me, is that their interactions with TPD oftentimes make them feel like they've been targeted or they're being harassed by them, or, you know, and I'm aware of this. And it's my job as an at-large member to literally listen to anybody who wants to talk to me. And I engage in conversations with people on all sides of issues all the time. And you know, I just want to make sure that people understand that this is all about just asking ourselves, what can we do to be better?
You are backing new police reform legislation. So can you walk me through what that legislation is and what it will do?
Well, you know, the first thing that I did was, and I will tell you, I have been working with a fairly large group of individuals, folks who approached me and said, hey, we have ideas, we want to do this. Some of them are activists, right? There's Jay LaFew, who is a UT student who has been doing a lot of organizing with Toledo Together. They've been kind of out and about all over. I have Rashaya G, who's a friend of mine, but she's a law professor at the University of Toledo and teaches law and civil rights. We have an organizational theorist on our group, right? So diverse backgrounds of folks with fields of interest that I think are important to all take into consideration. And it's larger than that, but you know, we first took a look at how can we talk about accountability, right? Because to me, there's a few buckets here. We're talking about funding, we're talking about transparency, we're talking about accountability. And you know, trust falls into that accountability piece. And so the first piece that I did was merely to say, hey, when you come into contact with our police department, you should know who you're talking to. And because people want to be able to communicate their experience, good or bad, but they want to do it with all the information. And I believe that if you pay for something through taxes, you have every right to know what it is and who it is in these instances. So all we did was introduce legislation that requires on the business cards that many of the officers already are carrying around to include the number. It's going to now include the number for the Internal Investigations Department, Internal Affairs Department. Originally, we had said the Civilian Review Board, but it's now going to be the Internal Affairs Department. But have the number for them and their badge number and their name, right? It's just simple. Because when I meet a person, the first thing I want to know is, hey, what's your name? Breaks down a barrier that exists. If I approach you and I say, you know, I have a lot of questions for you and I'm not going to give you any information, it can make an experience maybe a little more trepidatious. So that's all that happened on that. I did, however, then start to work on the concept of building a task force because I recognize that, you know, my jumping in with that piece, although not necessarily like immediately getting rid of no-knocks, although I agree that I think that we should likely get rid of no-knock warrants. You know, I didn't jump into like really heavy policy pieces right away because I think that we should as a community have conversation about this and that, you know, we should really study these things, you know, and make sure that what we're doing is right and that it's not just merely reactionary. A lot of people saw my first action as reactionary, but it was really just signaling, all right, we're listening and we're going to move, you know? So I helped to form a task force that has now been created and has 35 members from the community. It has police officers, it has representation from the police union, and it has general members of the community. It has some faith leaders. It's got some business owners. You know, I mean, there's representation from all across the city who are going to sit and really flush these details out. And I think one of the important things is that we worked in that there will be no politicians in the room, right? We don't want to make this political. We want to make this about our community and we want to make sure that voices are being heard. And so I'm really excited about the process that will come. The first thing they're going to look at is the Civilian Review Board. and really just take a strong look. Does it have any power now? Should it have power? What should those powers be? What are the options that people can have through that? So, I mean, these are all really important questions that we need to be asking, and will, I believe, lead to a more transparent, a more trustworthy, a more appropriate way for us to all sort of be living in this society together, right? Because we have to live with one another. We don't have an option. There are humans everywhere. And when we do so, we should be doing that with care and respect. And I'm just really excited about the possibilities that can come from the task force.
Do you believe this legislation will go far enough and prevent police violence?
You know, look, the reality is, if you know, when you talk to folks who talk about the history of policing, many of them will trace it all the way back to the folks who tracked down and traced down slaves who, you know, I don't even want to say slaves. I want to get away from that language. I want to talk about people who were kidnapped, people who were held against their will, right? You know, and when they ran to seek their freedom, they were sought after, they were tracked, they were hunted, right? And people will say that's the root of policing. And although we are many decades from that moment, it's not too far in our past, but it is far enough that they will say that policing looks different. It's no longer that same sort of mentality. But many people will still also argue that the sort of mentality that started the institution of policing is what has carried through, right? And so that's why you still see, even in the 60s during the civil rights era, you know, the use of excessive force against people. And it only when television really sort of started to show these instances of excessive force did people finally understand, white people for the most part, finally understand the actions that were being used against people of color that they weren't experiencing, right? A friend of mine recently posted, he got pulled over while riding his motorcycle that he just got. And he said that, you know, he didn't even think twice when he reached into his bag to find his insurance, right? I mean, he didn't even think twice because he's white and he doesn't have to think about that. Whereas, you know, we have seen videos of unarmed Black individuals across this country do far less, keep their hands on a wheel and still be shot, right? So I think the reality is that this conversation is about a cultural shift. And when you think about cultural shifts, they take a lot of time. So I don't think that legislation necessarily is going to be the answer to this. I think it will help to create a more transparent, a more trusting environment. But ultimately, it is really going to take, I mean, I really believe that police departments, police unions, police members need to really sort of say to themselves, you know, am I responsible for any of this as an institution, right? Not an individual. You know, everybody would say that they're not racist. Each individual would say that, but it doesn't mean that you right, like the institution itself couldn't be. And it's not this is not about trying to place blame. We're not trying to make people feel shamed. It's just, again, how do we make things better? How do we just improve? You know, nobody wants to have to feel like when they're driving from work to home that they need to be scared when the police lights come on behind them, right? They shouldn't be afraid of that. You know, these individuals are tasked with protecting and serving. And so I think that we all just have some fundamental questions to be asking ourselves, but we shouldn't be relying on legislation to be what it is that's going to change the culture. Culture is only going to change through the development of relationships and through the sort of reflection that is necessary in order for people to change their minds.
Finally, is there anything else you would like to be made known to residents of the city of Toledo?
I too am going through this, so maybe, you know, this is just a reach out to folks, right? The reality is that COVID-19 has sort of locked us all down, and we are social creatures, social beings. What it has led to is many of us are home and we're able to see things through a different lens, and we're in an environment where we're seeing things differently because we're home and we have some more time to do those types of things. Many people are. And so I think that's why you see such a big uprising around Black Lives Matter, right? It's grown. I mean, even 6 months ago, many people would still balk at the concept of Black Lives Mattering. But now the majority of people across this country believe that Black Lives Matter, right? And so I think all of this is because we're all in this moment going through something that COVID-19, it's indiscriminate, right? It doesn't matter. A virus doesn't care about your socioeconomic status. It doesn't care about your existing health. It doesn't care. I mean, all of these things, none of it matters. So all of us are impacted in the same way. And many of us can feel alone. Many of us can feel downtrodden, like the economy that is sort of roller coastering right now is going to be an impact, but the reality is we're all still here, that we're really taking a moment to reflect. We're taking a moment to reconsider. These things are important. And I would just say, continue to have an open mind. The world is not going to look the same when we come out on the other end of this. And I think that all of us can, through this moment, have some patience with one another, understand that we're all going through something very traumatic, something very large, and just remember to breathe, check in on individuals that you know and love, care for one another, right? I mean, this is a moment about us moving forward humanity in a way that we can come out of this better prepared for something like this happening next time. I mean, I think this is just a pivotal moment in humanity, and we should recognize that and not be afraid of it, but look at it as a moment of opportunity and optimism. And so it's hard to see that, I think, and it's hard from my perspective, taking a look at budgets and, what the community impact is and thinking about those things. But I too know that no matter what, we will continue forward at some point. And I think it's a magical kind of experience in its own way.
Councilmember Nick Komives, thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Jaden.